Hello and happy May Day, comrades. So in this video, in honor of May 1st, the real Labor Day, the traditional working people's Labor Day, we're going to talk about an essay, an article by one of my favorite thinkers of the socialist tradition, the Scottish-born Irish nationalist and socialist revolutionary James Connolly. So this is an article called Socialism and Nationalism from 1897, and in it, Connolly deals with the question of the sort of emerging cultural nationalism of Ireland during this period, in a period now known as the Celtic Revival. And the big question that he's really interested in is whether nationalism without socialism or socialism without nationalism is feasible. Now, I do want to say, because there's a couple of things that are worth prefacing here. One is that this is 1897, and so the idea of National Socialism or Nazism, which comes into existence in the 1930s, was not decidedly not what Connolly is talking about here. Connolly is talking about nationalism in the sense of the national liberation movement in Ireland, the quest for independence from Britain, of which Connolly was a major proponent. The other thing that I think is maybe worth touching on here is that in the contemporary left in the US and in, I think, Western Europe, for instance, the term nationalism has kind of a bad reputation, which is not entirely unjustified. I myself am quite skeptical of the term nationalism, but I think it's worth noting that there is a particular sense in which Connolly is using this term that differs from what, say, contemporary Americans might associate with nationalism. So this is in a colonized context. Ireland was a colony of England and then Britain, and throughout Ireland's history, they were quite a rebellious colony. There were frequent uprisings and revolts and things like this. But by the 1880s, 1890s, these things were really starting to coalesce into a Celtic revival movement, which attempted to assert the validity and the value of traditional Irish Celtic culture, and a resurgent political movement of which Connolly was a member. This is very different than nationalism in the context of a country like the United States, where nationalism often means things like xenophobia, American exceptionalism, regressive nostalgia, things like this, even direct racism against Americans of different races, creeds, colors, etc., etc. So Connolly is not talking about like Irish exceptionalism, wave the flag, Ireland, conquer the world because we're better than everybody else. He's talking about nationalism in the colonialist context of the legitimacy of home rule, which was sort of the first stage that many Irish independence supporters pushed for. And in the 1890s, that was a big thing that was being pushed for, was the idea of home rule as allowing Ireland to govern itself as a first step toward independence. Later, by, say, 1916, when the Easter Rising occurs, there's a much more concerted push for direct independence. So Connolly, let's talk Connolly for just a second before we talk about this essay, Socialism and Nationalism. Connolly was as I said, an Irish nationalist. He was a socialist. He was a big supporter of Irish independence. He was a big supporter of Irish labor. He, for instance, in 1913 to 1914, he was a leading figure in the Dublin lockout, which was a major general strike in Dublin, which was ultimately unsuccessful, unfortunately. But Connolly was a leading figure of that in the attempt to wrestle workers' rights away from the Irish capitalist class, which was, in fact, often an English capitalist class or an Anglo-Irish capitalist class. After the failure of the Dublin lockout, Connolly goes on to be one of the founding members of a group called the Irish Citizens' Army, which was a socialist revolutionary group dedicated to Irish liberation, and they were central players in the Easter Rising of 1916, which is often, I think, somewhat accurately characterized as the first sort of spark that lights the way for the Irish War for Independence a few years later, really beginning in 1919. Connolly himself fought in the Easter Rising, and he was one of the group of leaders who was executed by the British afterwards. So Connolly was a big figure in late 19th and early 20th century Irish politics, and he was a big thought leader, sort of pushing back against exclusively the cultural nationalism that was emerging in Ireland at the time. Again, this return to Celtic literature, traditional Irish literature, the establishment of Irish language schools to preserve Irish as a language in the face of the imperial language of English. So this is the context, really, for Socialism and Nationalism, Connolly's essay. So I want to start by sort of talking through, or I want to read you some of the sections, and we'll talk through some of the big ideas Connolly is developing here, and we'll consider the importance of them. So the essay starts out, in Ireland at the present time there are at work a variety of agencies seeking to preserve the national sentiment in the hearts of the people. Those agencies, whether Irish language movements, literary societies, or commemoration committees, are undoubtedly doing a work of lasting benefit to this country in helping to save from extinction the precious racial and historic and national history, language, and characteristics of our people. Nevertheless, there is a danger that by too strict an adherence to their present methods of propaganda and consequent neglect of vital living issues, they may only succeed in stereotyping our historical studies into a worship of the past or crystallizing nationalism into a tradition, glorious and heroic indeed, but still only a tradition. Now, traditions may, and frequently do, provide materials for a glorious martyrdom, but can never be strong enough to ride the storm of a successful revolution. If the national movement of our day is not merely to reenact the sad old tragedies of our past history, it must show itself capable of rising to the exigencies of the moment. It must demonstrate to the people of Ireland that our nationalism is not merely morbid idealizing of the past, but is also capable of formulating a distinct and definite answer to the problems of the present, and a political and economic creed capable of adjustment to the wants of the future. So what Connolly is saying in the opening portion here is that while it is crucial to preserve Irish language, literature, culture, traditions, ways of life, worldviews, etc., these things in themselves are insufficient for gaining Irish liberation, and particularly, as we'll find out, for gaining social and economic justice in Ireland. So this is, I think, a really important critique here. There were a lot of, not necessarily apolitical, there were some apolitical, but there were a lot of quasi-political elements of the Celtic revival there seemed to be generally this sort of assumption that if Irish culture were valorized, that would galvanize the Irish people into a revolutionary capacity in response to British colonialism. And what Connolly is saying is, no, that's not sufficient. What you're doing with this is looking back to the past, but not looking forward to the future. And what you need for a revolutionary movement is an ideal for the future. You need a revolutionary ideology in order to move forward, to convince the common people, the working people, that it is worth pursuing independence and it is worth making the sacrifices required for the revolution. So Connolly proposes the goal of a republic, and he dismisses the idea, dismisses comparisons to the French Republic. He says here, not a republic as in France, where a capitalist monarchy with an elective head parodies the constitutional abortions of England, and an open alliance with the Muscovite despotism brazenly flaunts its apostasy to the traditions of the revolution. He goes on, not a republic as in the United States, where the power of the purse has established a new tyranny under the forms of freedom, where 100 years after the feat of the last British redcoat polluted the streets of Boston, British landlords and financiers impose upon American citizens a servitude compared with which the tax of pre-revolution days was a mere trifle. He goes on. He opposes these capitalist republics and instead proposes a socialist republic. He argues that the only way in which the Irish people, the common people, the working people who make up the vast bulk of Ireland's population can be convinced that the revolution is in their interests is through economic freedom, economic equity, and social justice. He addresses this objection that some might make that the wealthy classes, the aristocracy, and the capitalist bourgeoisie would be unwilling to sign on to a revolutionary cause that might threaten their wealth. And Connolly essentially says, so what? Fuck them. Either we get the people on our side, or we get a small number of the wealthy. And Connolly, as a socialist, clearly makes his choice. And he poses this question about what exactly a free Ireland would mean. And I think this is a really important question. And I think it's a question that should, in fact, be central to all nationalist or revolutionary movements. He says here, when you talk of freeing Ireland, do you mean only the chemical elements which compose the soil of Ireland, or is it the Irish people you mean? If the latter, from what do you propose to free them? From the rule of England? But all systems of political administration and governmental machinery are but the reflex of the economic forms which underlie them. English rule in England is but the symbol of the fact that English conquerors in the past forced upon this country a property system founded upon spoliation, fraud, and murder, that, as the present-day exercise of the rights of property so originated, involves the continual practice of legalized spoliation and fraud. English rule is found to be the most suitable form of government by which the spoliation can be protected, and an English army the most pliant tool with which to execute judicial murder when the fears of the propertied classes demand it. The socialist who would destroy, root and branch, the whole brutally materialistic system of civilization, which, like the English language we have adopted as our own, is, I hold, a far more deadly foe to English rule and tutelage than the superficial thinker who imagines it possible to reconcile Irish freedom with those insidious but disastrous forms of economic subjugation, landlord tyranny, capitalist fraud, and unclean usury. So essentially what he's saying here is if we're going to have an Irish Republic, if we're going to have a revolutionary movement, We need to determine what the objective of that revolutionary movement is. If it is to be national liberation under a capitalist model, then we maintain the power systems of English colonialism. We maintain the rule of the English. And he goes on to say this even more clearly slightly later. He says, if you remove the English army tomorrow and hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle, unless you set about the organization of the Socialist Republic, your efforts would be in vain. England would still rule you. She would rule you through her capitalists, through her landlords, through her financiers, through the whole array of commercial and individualist institutions she has planted in this country and watered with the tears of our mothers and the blood of our martyrs. England will still rule you to your ruin, even while your lips offer hypocritical homage at the shrine of that freedom whose cause you have betrayed. Nationalism without socialism, without a reorganization of society on the basis of a broader and more developed form of that common property which underlay the social structure of ancient Erin, is only national recreancy. This is, I think, a really important idea because, this is the global financial system we currently live under. The term nowadays is neo-colonialism. Many independent countries, nominally independent countries at the very least, have their resources, have their industrial capacity owned by capitalist interests outside of their own nation. Which means that the wealth of those nations is very often drained away to big multinational corporations rather than preserved within the country for the benefit of the people of that country. Connolly is clearly anticipating this here when he says England would rule you through her capitalists, through her landlords, through her financiers, through the whole array of commercial and individualist institutions she has planted in this country. What he's talking about is economic neo-colonialism. Again, the idea that, say, a resource-rich country in Central Africa, for instance, may have much of its natural and mineral resources controlled by companies based in the US or the UK or France or someplace like this. Like, these resources and the tremendous amounts of wealth that they generate may be owned externally. But Connolly's point here is even more insidious. He says the capitalist structure itself, this way of looking at the world, where the propertied classes are privileged and have disproportionate control over the lives of the vast majority of the population, this is itself an English imposition, an imperialist imposition designed to control and constrain Irish freedom, Irish liberty. So he ends this article with this section, basically calling on anyone who supports Irish independence to embrace the cause of a socialist republic. He says, it would be tantamount to a public declaration that our oppressors had so far succeeded in inoculating us with their perverted conceptions of justice and morality that we finally decided to accept those conceptions as our own and no longer needed an alien army to force them upon us. In other words, we would, if we preserve capitalism and the systems of oppression, the systems of inequality, the systems of exploitation inherent to it, it would be the same as us saying, we will colonize, we will act as our own colonial police force on behalf of the English. And he finishes here. As a socialist, I'm prepared to do all one man can do to achieve for our motherland her rightful heritage, independence. But if you ask me to abate one jot or tittle of the claims of social justice in order to conciliate the privileged classes, then I must decline. Such action would be neither honorable nor feasible. Let us never forget that he never reaches heaven who marches thither in the company of the devil. Let us openly proclaim our faith. The logic of events is with us. So that last bit, the logic of events is with us, this is like straight Marxist dialectic materialism, right? The idea that events occur because history has a natural course that it undergoes, that the movement of history as such is inherently toward a freer, socialist, and probably ultimately communist social system. But this idea that so the point he makes here at the end, I think, is a really, really good one, that if all that is sought is the form of national independence without economic justice and social justice to provide people a fair and decent standard of life, then what you have achieved is not freedom, is not even independence. What you have achieved is servitude by other means. This is Connolly's ultimate argument here, and I think it's a really, really important one, more so for developing nations still trying to define their national identities and characters after revolutionary movements for independence. But even in well-established countries like the US, the UK, Canada, Russia, places like this, the idea of the necessity for social justice to go hand in hand with national identity and national power in order to create a society that lives up to the promises implied in the word society. That is, a system in which everyone can exist and be and have a legitimate place. This is, I think, one of the key insights we can take from Connolly. If we do not have social and economic justice, even if we have the form of national freedom, we have slavery.